You've recently said that you're a conservative leaning. Maybe that's a day-to-day thing. Maybe you can push back. But so you have somebody like your friend, John McWhorter,
Yeah.
who could say is on your left,
Yeah.
to the left of you. And then you have somebody like Thomas Sowell, who maybe is on to the right of you.
Yeah, probably.
And yet there's a lot of overlap between the three of you.
Right.
So to what degree does politics affect your view on race in America? And maybe to what degree does your view on race affect your politics?
Okay.
And that, for people who don't know, has shifted over time. You've been on quite a roller coaster, as anybody who thinks about the world should be.
Well, let's begin with the fact that I was trained as an economist in a tradition of what many people would call neoliberalism. I was trained at MIT, which was not a right-wing place by any means, but it was a place where you learned about markets and about the benefits of capitalism as a way of organizing society, the virtues of free enterprise, the fact that the pursuit of profit was not necessarily a bad thing, but it well might be the road to prosperity and to economic growth. The idea that private property and individuals seeking to acquire and succeeding in acquiring wealth did create inequality, but it also created opportunity. And it also expanded our knowledge and our control over the physical environment in which we're embedded in, et cetera. So we were not Marxists at MIT, although we did read Marx. I mean, those of us who were intellectually curious, you read Marx. Marx was an important figure in the history of the West, and I think Marx should be read. And Capital, 3 volumes, et cetera. Alienation of labor and whatnot. The implications of modernization, of the advent of industrial capitalism, et cetera. That kind of dynamic deserves to be studied and to come at it in a critical way, informed by the intellectual inheritance of Marx and Marxism. I think that's a part of a full education in social philosophy and economic analysis that open-minded person ought to acquaint themselves with. But at the end of the day, I think that the free marketeers have the better of it. I think the story of the 20th century, as far as economic development is concerned, reflects that. I think that the experiments where centralized control over economic decisions was the order of the day failed. I think that the fact of the 21st century rise of China as a force has a lot to do with the spread of, in effect, capitalist-oriented modes of economic exchange, freeing up prices, markets, property, and so forth. Although obviously it's a complicated political economic system. I'm talking about China. But I think that the story of the 20th century and the hope for the 21st century is that prosperity is enhanced through the free exchange of goods and the pursuit and acquisition of property by people in a more or less capitalist-oriented system. That's the view that I hold. I guess that makes me a conservative. I don't know. I want to say that's not to the exclusion of a social safety net. I'm not saying that old people in an ideal social system would be left to their own devices, regardless of whether or not they had saved for their retirement. I'm not saying that the ideal of extending decent access to healthcare to all people, regardless of whether or not they can afford it, decent access to education to people, regardless of whether or not they can afford it, is standing in the way of prosperity. I don't believe that. I think the mixed economies that we see in Northern Europe and in North America are a balancing of the virtues of free enterprise, property, and the pursuit of wealth on the one hand, against the the needs to have a decent society in which people who fall between the cracks, nevertheless, are bolstered through a sense of social solidarity that is accommodated by our common membership within a single nation state, which is why I think nationalism is important. And it's why I think borders are important, because without a coherent polity who can see themselves as in a common situation and agree through their politics to support each other to some extent, you can't sustain a safety net. You cannot have a social safety net for a global population. You can only have a social safety net for a bounded population who have a sense of common membership in an ongoing political enterprise, which they pay their dues through their taxes in order to sustain it. There's a balancing that has to go on. So that's the first thing that I would say about my politics. I'm a neoliberal economist. I believe in markets. I believe in prices. I believe in profit. Corporations are not an incarnation of evil. Corporations are a legal nexus through which production gets organized, in which you solicit the cooperation of workers, of people who provide capital, of people who provide raw materials and input, of customers, and so on. And that functionality allows for the production of goods and their distribution and the earning of income and its distribution, which at the end of the day is the foundation of our prosperity. Corporations are people too. Mitt Romney got in trouble for saying that in 2012. But corporations are nothing but a legal fiction. The corporation is not a person as such, but the nexus of contracts and relationships amongst the stakeholders who intersect in the context of the corporation is the way in which we organize the massively complex set of activities that are necessary in order to produce economic benefits, in order to feed people, in order to have everybody with a cell phone in their pocket, in order to be able to travel from one side of a continent to another on a device that is with almost absolute certainty going to safely take off and land, and in order to be able to build cities and et cetera.
But do the markets, the ideal of the market, collide with the ideal of all men are created equal? The identity, the struggle that we've been talking about of what it means to sort of empower humans that make up this great country. Do they collide, and where do they collide?
Well, markets are going to produce inequality, and all men being equal is a statement about the intrinsic worth of people, not about the situation that will come about when people interact with each other through markets, because people are actually different. And because there are factors that are beyond anybody's control called luck and chance that, you and I both invest. It looked a priori like your investment and my investment were equally likely to succeed. But as a matter of fact, ex post facto, your investment succeeds, my investment doesn't succeed. I don't have wealth and you have wealth. That is an inevitable consequence of an environment in which both of us are free to make our investment choices, and where the consequences of investment depend in part upon random circumstances over which no one has control. But you asked me about my politics, and I was just trying to lay down a foundation by saying I begin as an economist in the tradition of liberalism, Adam Smith and so forth, John Maynard Keynes for that matter, and so forth, that Milton Friedman and so forth, that Paul Samuelson, Bob Solow, James Tobin, and so forth, Thomas Sowell, yes, that appreciates property, the virtues of free enterprise, the set of institutions that allow for security of contract, a rule of law, things of this kind. So that's one thing to say about my politics. Another thing to say about my politics, and you're right, I've moved around, is that, I began south side of Chicago, black kid. I was a liberal Democrat. I encountered the economics curriculum at the MIT, and I became trained in economics in the tradition that I've just described. And I encountered also the Reagan Revolution. This is the late 70s and early 80s. These are big debates about economic policy and so on. And I found a lot to admire in the supply-siders, the people who were saying, let's get the government out of the way, the people who were worried about national debt, which is a lot more now than it was then, the people who were worried that the welfare state could be too big, that the incentives of transfer programs could be counterproductive, that you had a war on poverty, and we did have a war on poverty, and poverty won. And there's a lot of evidence that the war on poverty was lost by the people who were trying to, quote unquote, eradicate poverty in our time. That incentives really do matter, and that the state, which is driven by politics, is often unresponsive to the dictates of incentives, whereas markets eliminate people who are inefficient and who are not cognizant of the consequences of incentives because they can't cover their bottom line, and they won't persist for very long if they can't cover their bottom line. They're forced to respond to the realities of differences in costs and benefits and so forth in a way that governments can cover because they have their hand in our pocket. They can cover their losses and they can make accounts balanced, notwithstanding their mistakes, because they can take my property by fiat, by the power of the state. The tax collector comes. If I don't pay, he seizes my holdings. And they can carry on in that way. They need the corrective influence of markets in order to be responsive to the realities of life. I mean, I may not like it that prices are telling me that something that I want to do is infeasible. I may not like it. But what the prices are telling me is that the costs of doing it exceed the benefits to be derived from doing it. And if I persist in doing it, notwithstanding that, I'm going to run losses, and those losses will accumulate. And the net effect of that over an entire society is stagnation and ultimate attenuation of the economic benefits that might be available to people. Again, I think if you look at the developing world in the post-colonial period, the second half of the 20th century, that's exactly what you see. Planning doesn't work. Centralized control over resource allocation doesn't work. Okay, so I became more conservative in that respect. But I also, and this has to do with race, lost faith in the posture that what became of the civil rights movement. I mean, the civil rights movement, you quote King 1963, the civil rights movement starts out as, we want equal membership in the polity. But it becomes a systematized cover, I'm going to argue, for deficiencies that are discernible within Black American society, which only we could correct. That's a very controversial statement. I make it with trepidation. I don't take any pleasure in saying it, but here's what I'm talking about. So I'm talking about the family. So the family is a matter internal to the community about how men and women relate to each other and engage in social reproduction, childbearing, the standing up of households, the context within which children are developed, are maturing, and so forth and so on. So the African-American family is in trouble. I think I can demonstrate that by reference to high rates of marital dissolution, by high rates of birth to out of wedlock, and so forth. You can't even say that the African-American family is in trouble. Violence. Homicide is an order of magnitude more prevalent amongst African Americans than it is in the society as a whole. This is behavior. It's behavior of our people. I speak of Black people. Of course, we're not the only people in society for whom violence is an issue. It's an order of magnitude more prevalent in our communities. I'm talking about schooling and school failure. So we have affirmative action as a cover. It's a Band-Aid on differences in the development of intellectual performance, which is only partly a consequence of the natural intelligence of people and largely a consequence of how people spend their time, what they value, how they discipline themselves, what they do with their opportunities, how parents raise their children, what peer groups value, and things of this kind. The Asian students who are scoring off the charts on these exams are doing it not because they're intrinsically more intelligent than other people, but because they work harder, because their parents are more insistent on focusing on their intellectual performance, because they're disciplined, because of the way that they devote their time and their resources to equipping their children to function in the 21st century. This is what I believe. I think it's demonstrably the case. And it is a factor in racial disparity. The way that the civil rights movement has evolved under the wing of the Democratic Party into an organized apologia for the failures of African Americans to seize the opportunities that exist for us now in the 21st century, but did not exist in the first half of the 20th century. The way in which the civil rights movement has become an avoidance mechanism for us not taking, we African Americans, responsibility. This is Glenn Loury. Not everybody's going to agree with it. Is part of what makes me a conservative. I am tired of the belly aching. I'm tired of the white supremacy. It is, in my mind, a joke. I lament the fact that that kind of rhetoric is so seductively attractive to African Americans and so widely adopted by others. As I am fond of saying, at the end of the day, nobody is coming to save us. I mean, higher education, MIT, Caltech, Stanford, where the future is happening, that is about mastery over the achievements of human civilization, such as they manifest themselves in the 21st century. There's no substitute for actually acquiring mastery over the material. There's no substitute for that. To be patronized, to have the standards lowered, they want to get rid of the test. They want to tell African Americans, pat us on the head. We're going to have a separate program for you. We're going to give you a side door that you can come into. That doesn't make us any smarter. It doesn't make us any more creative. And it doesn't make us any more fit for the actual competition that's unfolding before us. Now, you want to be 10% of the population that's carried along for the next 100 years? You want to be a ward of the state in the late 21st century? You go ahead. Because the Chinese are coming. You're not going to hold them back. The world is being remade every decade by new ways of seeing and new ways of doing. If you don't get on board with the dynamic advancement of the civilization in which we are embedded, you're going to end up being dependent on other people to look kindly upon you. And this story that you've got, this belly ache, this excuse, my ancestors were slaves, is only going to work for so long. So that makes me, I suppose, a kind of conservative. I hate affirmative action. I don't just disagree with it. I don't just think it's against the 14th Amendment. I hate it. The hatred comes from an understanding that it is a Band-Aid, that it is a substitute for the actual development of the capacities of our people to compete. I'd much rather be in the position of having them try to keep me out because I'm so damn good, like they're doing with the Asians, than having them have to beg the Supreme Court to allow for a special dispensation on my behalf because they need diversity and inclusion and belonging. It's not just diversity. It's not just diversity and inclusion. It's diversity and inclusion and belonging. I'm whining because I feel like I don't belong. That's a position of weakness. It's pathetic. And it's only political correctness that keeps people who can see this, and believe me, a lot of people can see it, from saying so out loud.
So you want the Black American community to represent strength.
Correct. And I want us to deal with what it is that we have to deal with in order to be able to project strength in an increasingly competitive world.